you're not my daughter anymore." My husband said it standing up from the head of the table, his napkin still folded neatly in one hand, as though he'd merely finished dinner instead of ending our family. Nobody moved, not my cousins, not my brother, not my own mother sitting beside me, not me. Claire just sat there, 22 years old, one hand resting protectively across the small curve of her stomach, staring at her father as if she'd misunderstood what she'd just heard. Then she looked at me. I have replayed that look for 12 years. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't even frightened. It was hopeful, just for a few seconds. She honestly believed her mother was about to say something. I had maybe 30 seconds to become the woman my daughter thought I was. I used every one of them saying nothing at all. Claire nodded once. Not because she agreed with him, because she finally understood me. She stood, quietly pushed her chair back beneath the table, picked up her coat, and walked toward the front door without another word. Nobody stopped her. I didn't even stand up. By morning, her 2 suitcases were already sitting on the porch. I watched from the kitchen window as Ray loaded them into the back of his old pickup. Claire never looked back at the house. At the time, I told myself that meant she was angry. I know now it meant she'd already accepted there was nothing left inside worth turning around for. It took me 12 years to understand how wrong I was about almost everything that happened after that night, including which one of us actually left the family. My name is Margaret Whitfield. I'm 58 years old. My husband Gerald built a real estate development company from a single strip mall outside Tulsa back when we were younger than Claire was that Christmas. Claire is our only daughter. That night, she was 22, pregnant, and deeply in love with a mechanic named Ray Kessler, a good man with rough hands, quiet dignity, and no college degree, which, in Gerald's mind, somehow made him unworthy of our family. Gerald gave her a choice in front of everyone gathered around that Christmas table. Leave Ray, give up the baby, or leave us. Claire chose Ray. She chose her baby. And I chose silence. That was the decision that changed every life sitting around that table. For the first year, we heard almost nothing. A cousin mentioned, at some family gathering, that she'd heard Claire was waitressing somewhere outside the city, struggling, barely getting by. Gerald nodded, like that confirmed something he'd already decided was true. I didn't ask any follow-up questions. I told myself not asking was a kind of respect for her privacy. I understand now it was mostly just easier than facing what we'd done. By the second year, the rumors changed shape. Someone said Claire seemed to be doing better. Nobody asked how. A family friend mentioned, almost in passing, that Ray's old garage down on the east side had gotten bought out and fully renovated. New sign and everything. We assumed some developer had simply seen potential in the location. Nobody in our family thought to wonder where a mechanic and a young mother would have found that kind of money themselves. Every December, a Christmas card showed up in our mailbox with no return address, just 2 initials signed inside, CK. I never told Gerald about those cards. I kept every single one in a drawer in my nightstand, and every year I told myself I'd write back, and every year I didn't, because I couldn't figure out what I'd even say to her that wouldn't sound like an apology I wasn't sure I'd earned yet. Around the 4th year, Gerald's company started landing unusually good deals from a company I'd never heard of, something called Wren Holdings. Favorable terms, patient timelines, exactly the kind of breaks a struggling development company needs and rarely gets. Gerald mentioned it to me once, pleased, calling it a lucky break with a new lender. Wren was my own maiden name before I married him. It never once crossed my mind that it meant anything. A few years after that, at a cousin's wedding, an anonymous gift quietly covered the entire venue cost, no name attached anywhere. The family assumed it had come from one of Gerald's old business partners, a man known for that kind of quiet generosity. Nobody asked him directly. Nobody needed to. The story simply settled into place, the way stories do when nobody's willing to look too closely at them. It was around the ninth year that I found the torn corner of a document in Gerald's study, tucked behind some old files I was straightening up. Just a scrap, really, referencing something called a prior debt restructuring, with the name Wren Holdings printed along the edge. I didn't understand what I was looking at. I remember standing there in his study a long moment, feeling something I couldn't name yet, before I folded it back into the file exactly where I'd found it and closed the drawer. I kept that scrap of paper in my mind longer than I expected to. A few weeks later, I finally worked up the nerve to ask Gerald, casually, over dinner, who exactly Wren Holdings was. He waved the question off, the way he waved off most things he didn't fully understand himself. Some quiet investor, he said. Doesn't matter who, as long as the terms are good. I let it drop that night. I didn't let it drop inside my own head. I started paying closer attention after that, in small ways Gerald never noticed. I noticed how often that name came up in his phone calls. I noticed he'd never once met anyone from the company in person, only ever communicated through a lawyer. I noticed, and I told myself I was probably imagining a connection that wasn't really there. At a family dinner not long after, someone finally brought up the cousin's wedding gift again, wondering aloud whatever happened to the mystery of who'd paid for it. Gerald said, with total confidence, that it had to have been his old business partner, Walter Pruitt, a man who'd made a habit over the years of quiet, generous gestures like that. Someone even called Walter directly, right there at the table, to thank him properly. Walter, on speakerphone, sounded genuinely confused. He said he had no idea what they were talking about, that he hadn't given anyone a wedding gift in years. The table laughed it off, decided he was just being modest the way he always was, and moved on to dessert. I sat there and felt something small and cold settle in my stomach, a feeling I didn't yet have a name for, watching an entire family agree, out loud, to believe an explanation that had just failed its only real test. It was a distant cousin at yet another family gathering who mentioned it without realizing what she was handing me. She said she'd run into Claire at a farmer's market and met her younger one, a little girl, maybe 4 years old. I sat very still and did the math in my head. Claire had a second child. A whole small person existed in this world who I had never once met, never once held, never once even known the name of. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, for the first time in 12 years, I wrote back to one of those Christmas cards, using an email address I found through an old mutual friend, not to reconcile, not really, just because the guilt of a granddaughter I'd never met had finally outweighed the fear of facing what I'd let happen. Claire wrote back 3 days later. She agreed to meet me for coffee, on her terms, at a place of her choosing, no promises about what it would mean. I want to tell you honestly, I expected that coffee to be about forgiveness, or the lack of it. It wasn't, not really, not directly. Claire looked older in a way that had nothing to do with age, calmer than I remembered, like someone who'd stopped needing anyone else's approval a long time ago. She told me about her daughter Sadie, 4 years old, and her son Eli, now 12, born the same year we threw her out. Then, gently, without any anger in her voice at all, she told me the rest. She and Ray had struggled those first couple years, exactly the way the rumors said. But Claire had gone back to school at night, gotten into real estate finance, and eventually built her own small advisory firm from nothing, the same way her father once had. She was good at it. Better than good, it turned out. 3 years before that coffee, she said, she'd been doing routine work, reviewing regional development companies, and came across her own father's name in a set of distressed debt filings. Whitfield Development was quietly dying, buried under debt nobody outside a small circle knew about yet. She had the resources by then to simply let it collapse. Nobody would have known she had anything to do with it either way. Instead, she created a holding company, Wren Holdings, named for my maiden name, she told me, quietly. because some part of her had wanted at least one true thing tied to it, even hidden. She used it to quietly buy up the company's debt, restructure the terms, and keep it alive. Not for Gerald. She was very clear about that. The plainest thing she said all afternoon. She'd done it for the roughly 200 employees on his payroll, people who'd had nothing to do with what happened to her. People who would have lost their jobs and their health insurance and their mortgages over a decision they never made and never even knew about. She'd never told anyone. Not her father. Not me. She said she hadn't done it to be thanked. She'd done it because she understood, in a way none of us in that family ever quite had, what it actually feels like to have your whole life upended by someone else's decision, and she hadn't wanted 200 families to learn that same lesson because of hers. I want to pause here because I think a lot of you watching already understand a feeling like this one. Realizing someone you hurt badly turned out to be more decent than you ever gave them credit for. Quietly, for years, without asking for anything back. If stories like this are why you keep coming back to this channel, I'd really love it if you'd subscribe. It means a lot, knowing these are the kinds of stories worth telling. I sat across from my daughter in that coffee shop and understood, for the first time in 12 years, exactly how small I'd let myself become in comparison to her. Gerald didn't learn any of this from Claire. He learned it from his own board, during an emergency meeting about the company's finances, when the identity behind Wren Holdings finally had to be disclosed as part of a larger refinancing deal. I wasn't in that room, but he told me about it afterward, furious in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. He assumed immediately that Claire had done this to eventually humiliate him, to buy his own company out from under him, quietly, patiently, and take it from him the moment it suited her. He drove straight to her office that same afternoon and accused her of it directly, of playing games with his life's work. Claire didn't raise her voice back at him, not even once. She told him, calmly, that she'd actually been planning to walk away from her position in Wren Holdings that very quarter to simply let the company fail on its own, for one specific reason that had nothing to do with money at all. She'd recently learned that for 12 years he'd been telling people, at dinners and business functions and even to some of their own extended family, that she had abandoned the family. Not that he'd thrown her out, that she'd left. She told him the real version was documented, dated, provable. If anyone ever bothered to check the timeline against what he'd been saying for over a decade. The real betrayal, she said, wasn't the debt or the money or even the ultimatum that Christmas. It was that he'd quietly rewritten the whole story afterward to make himself the wounded party, and that I had known the true version the entire time and had never once corrected it. Gerald called a family dinner not long after that, the kind with extended family and, notably, 2 members of his company's board present, people he clearly wanted watching this play out a certain way. He stood at the head of the same table where all of this had started 12 years earlier, and he made a show of forgiving Claire, publicly, warmly, performing exactly the kind of magnanimous father he needed those board members to believe he'd always been. Claire sat there and let him finish. She didn't correct him. She didn't need to, not yet, because I finally understood, watching my husband perform forgiveness for an audience instead of actually asking for it, that this was the moment I'd been avoiding for 12 years, and if I let it pass, I'd be complicit in the rewrite one more time, permanently, in front of witnesses. So I spoke. For the first time in this entire story, I actually spoke. I told that table the truth, that Gerald hadn't forgiven Claire for anything, because Claire had never done anything that needed forgiving in the first place, that he was the one who stood up that Christmas and said she wasn't his daughter anymore, that I was the one who sat there and said nothing while it happened, and that I'd spent 12 years telling myself my silence wasn't the same as his cruelty, when the truth was, it had simply been a quieter version of the exact same thing. I told them about the scrap of paper I'd found in his study years earlier, and never asked about directly. About the Christmas cards I'd kept hidden in a drawer instead of ever writing back. About Walter Pruitt's confused voice on speakerphone, and how the whole family had simply chosen to believe a story that had already failed its only real test, because the truth would have cost us something we weren't ready to pay yet. Claire didn't say a single word through any of it. She didn't need to. I watched every face at that table shift, slowly, from the story they'd believed for 12 years to something closer to what had actually happened. Claire spoke last, and what she said wasn't about revenge at all. She told her father she'd keep the company funded, but only on her own terms now. He would step down from the board, effective that quarter, and the truth of that Christmas would be acknowledged plainly. Not for her own sake, she said, but so her own children never grew up believing love could come with conditions attached to it. I left Gerald not long after that dinner. Not out of anger exactly, though there was plenty of that too, underneath everything else. I left because I finally understood something I don't think I'd let myself understand clearly before all of this happened. I'd spent 12 years believing my daughter was the one who walked away from this family. She never did. We were the ones who left her, that night at the table, and I think some part of me had always known it. I just hadn't wanted to admit how long I'd been standing quietly next to the man who did it, telling myself that standing there quietly wasn't the same thing as choosing a side. It was. It always had been. If this story meant something to you, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe. It helps me know these are the stories worth telling more of. The quiet ones about guilt, and about silence, and about what it actually costs a family when nobody's willing to say the hard thing out loud until it's almost too late. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you'd been sitting at that table 12 years ago, watching it happen, would you have said something in the moment, the way I wish I had? Or do you think some of us only ever find our voice once it's finally safe enough to use it?